Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking through the morning mist of a medieval village. The cobblestones are slick with dew, the air's crisp, laced with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. You hear the distant bell tolling from the church tower, slow, deep, and calling. You make your way down the narrow lane, past stone cottages and wooden carts, past a line of villagers, dressed in plain linen and wool, filing slowly toward the chapel. The church is the center of this world, not just a place of worship, but a place where the sacred and the everyday meet, a space where peasants and lords alike kneel under the same wooden beams, whispering prayers into the same flickering candlelight. But as you approach the heavy oak doors, you feel a tension. A strange hush falls over the crowd, not from fear of God, but from fear of judgment, not of your sins, but of your clothes. Because here, in the heart of the Middle Ages, what you wear inside the church could say more about your soul than your prayers ever could. The wrong color, the wrong fabric, a hemline too short, or a hood too fine. These things could be seen as more than poor taste. They could be seen as pride, vanity, even heresy. You glance down at your tunic, suddenly self-conscious. Is it too clean? Too rich a color? Have you mended it in the wrong place? Or worn a trim that might be mistaken for nobility? Behind you, someone murmurs about a neighbor being turned away last week. Something about dyed shoes. Another says a woman was asked to cover her head, and when she refused, she was made to kneel outside. Inside the chapel, the candles flicker against ancient stone. The priest adjusts his robes. And you realize this isn't just a place of peace. It's a place of rules, of eyes that watch, of unspoken expectations stitched into every cloak, belt, and veil. And so begins our journey into a world where faith and fashion collided, where your clothing was a statement of obedience or defiance, and where the line between reverence and rebellion was measured in thread. Inside the cool stone walls of the medieval church, judgment didn't always wait for the afterlife. It waited at the door. Picture this: a cold Sunday morning, and a village congregation gathers. Families approach slowly, heads bowed, but as they near the church steps, some hesitate, not from spiritual fear, but from uncertainty over what they're wearing. Because in many parts of medieval Europe, the first people you saw weren't fellow worshipers. They were inspectors. Sometimes it was the priest himself. Other times, appointed church wardens, volunteers tasked with watching, recording, reporting. These were the church's silent sentinels, the fashion police of God. Their job wasn't to listen to your confession. It was to study your tunic, to judge the dye in your sleeves, to measure your modesty with a glance. If your garments were too fine, too colorful, or too suggestive, even in subtle ways, you might be stopped. You could be denied entry, or worse, publicly shamed. And these weren't idle threats. In some towns, your name might be announced during the sermon, a quiet but devastating form of punishment. In others, you could be fined, your modest wages docked over something as small as a decorative clasp or silk lining. There were even cases where offenders were forced to sit at the very back of the church, apart from the rest of the congregation, a living example of spiritual imbalance. It sounds extreme, even absurd, but to the people of the time, these rules weren't about vanity. They were about order, morality, and control. Clothing revealed more than status. It revealed your place in the world. And the church, ever watchful, made sure you remembered it. Imagine standing at the entrance, heartbeat quickening, feeling the eyes of your neighbors, the priest, perhaps even God, all waiting to see if your garments were worthy, and all before you even stepped inside. To fully understand why clothing mattered so much in church, we need to step back and look at the sumptuary laws. some of the most peculiar and powerful rules of the medieval world. The word sumptuary comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expense, and that's exactly what these laws controlled. They weren't about faith at first. They were about economy, class, and social hierarchy. Designed by kings and nobles, these laws dictated who could wear what, based on wealth, status, and rank. If you were a peasant, your clothes had to be plain. Undyed wool, earth tones, no embroidery, no silk. If you were a merchant, maybe you were allowed a little more, a splash of color, perhaps a ring or a hat of modest value. But if you were nobility, that opened the door to velvet, satin, fur-lined cloaks, gold thread, and rare imported dyes. These weren't just fashion preferences. They were legally enforced distinctions. A baker caught wearing a belt reserved for knights could face fines. A farmer's wife who wore shoes with decorative stitching might be accused of vanity, or even impersonating a higher class, a serious offense. So how did this connect to the church? Because the church endorsed and enforced these laws too. After all, the medieval world believed that social order was divinely ordained. If God made you a peasant, you should dress like one, humbly, modestly, gratefully. Wearing clothes above your station wasn't just social climbing. It was seen as pride. And pride, in Christian teaching, is the deadliest of sins. So when you walked into church wearing a tunic too fine, or shoes with a little too much shine, you weren't just breaking fashion rules, you were challenging God's order. That's why priests preached against luxury. That's why parish records included wardrobe complaints. And that's why, even in the holiest of places, your outfit could condemn you before a single word left your mouth. In the quiet dimness of a medieval chapel, not all sins were spoken aloud. Some were worn. Because during the Middle Ages, certain colors and fabrics carried meanings far beyond fashion. They were signs of power, pride, defiance, or deceit. And for ordinary people, wearing the wrong shade could become an act of social rebellion. Let's start with one of the most infamous examples, purple. In much of Europe, purple was reserved exclusively for royalty, clergy, and the highest nobility. The dye, often made from rare sea snails or imported pigments, was staggeringly expensive. But beyond cost, it carried symbolism, the divine right of kings, the holiness of bishops, the bloodline of aristocrats. So, when a commoner appeared in church wearing a hint of purple, even a trim, it was more than bold. It was illegal. Other colors followed similar patterns. Deep reds and rich blues were often restricted to upper classes. Gold thread and silver embroidery were reserved for the elite. Even the fabric mattered. Silk? Only for those of rank. Fur lining? Only if you had the title to match. Linen and wool were the standards for most, and even those came with restrictions on cut, dye, and decoration. But here's where it gets even stranger. Sometimes religious symbolism clashed with class regulation. White, for instance, symbolized purity, a color often associated with piety. But too much white on a poor woman could raise suspicions. Was she trying to present herself as virtuous, or pretending to be something she wasn't? And green, the color of life, hope, and spring, was sometimes discouraged because of its connection to folk traditions, fertility rites, or even witchcraft in certain regions. In church, all of this mattered, not just because of the laws, but because clothing was watched. The wrong color could distract other worshipers. It could offend the eyes of the clergy. It could be seen as a mockery of both God and king. So people adjusted. Some wore extra cloaks to cover rich hues. Others dyed down fabrics to look duller. Some passed off inherited garments as gifts from nobles, hoping no one would question. Because in a world where faith and hierarchy were intertwined, Even a hemline could become a line you dared not cross. In the medieval imagination, there was no sin more seductive or more dangerous than vanity. Vanity wasn't just about admiring your reflection. It was the belief that your appearance, your status, your beauty mattered more than humility, faith, or the soul beneath the surface. And nowhere was this temptation more feared than in the house of God. The church taught that pride was the root of all sin. It was pride that led Lucifer to rebel. Pride that caused Eve to reach for the forbidden fruit. Pride that made men forget their place in the divine order. So when people arrived at church dressed too finely, when their cloaks shimmered, their shoes shined, or their belts sparkled with unnecessary detail, it wasn't seen as simply overdressing. It was seen as a spiritual danger. Clergymen across Europe warned that such vanity could lead others into temptation. That rich attire could distract the congregation, awaken envy, and corrupt the sacred quiet of prayer. In sermons, preachers liken fancy dress to a form of silent heresy. A woman in jeweled pins might be accused of seducing the eyes of others during Mass. A man in fitted sleeves might be seen as flaunting his wealth rather than bowing in reverence. The irony? Many of the clergy themselves wore beautiful, expensive vestments. But those garments were seen as symbolic, adorned not for self-glory, but to honor God. For the common man or woman, the rules were different. The faithful were expected to show modesty in all things, especially in clothing, to enter the sacred space as humbly as one would approach the gates of heaven. To be seen as vain, even unintentionally, could damage your reputation. A single whispered comment about your attire might follow you for weeks, even months. And for women, the scrutiny was even more intense. Loose hair, immodest, colorful trim, suggestive, uncovered ankles, scandalous. Some churches even provided veils at the door for those who came improperly dressed. Because in this world, beauty wasn't celebrated in church. It was feared. And the closer you stood to the altar, the more your garments had to disappear into silence. You might imagine that church dress codes in the Middle Ages were loose guidelines, quietly ignored like a dusty rule book. They weren't. They were enforced. And when someone crossed the line intentionally or not, the consequences could be public, humiliating, and unforgettable. Let's return to that village chapel on a sleepy Sunday morning. A young woman enters, wearing a vibrant cloak she borrowed from her cousin in town. She thinks it's modest, simple, but the fabric is imported wool, and the hue, deep crimson, catches the eye of the church warden. He pauses her at the door. Other villagers turn to look. Whispers ripple through the line. He asks where she got the cloak, if she purchased it, if she knows that color is forbidden to her class. She stammers, says it was a gift. Too late. The warden lifts his hand and gestures to the priest inside. She's denied entry. Turned away, not for being unfaithful, not for her sins, but for the shade of red on her shoulders. In some towns, things went further. Names of fashion offenders would be written down and read aloud at the end of Mass. In larger cities, there were officials, sumptuary inspectors, who patrolled marketplaces, churches, and town squares, ready to fine anyone caught wearing the wrong fabrics. Fines could range from a few coins to the confiscation of garments, to public penance, standing at the church entrance with bare feet and a sign hung around the neck, confessing one's vanity before the entire congregation. In rare but documented cases, nobles who violated church dress codes in defiance were excommunicated. For peasants, such punishment was spiritual death, being cut off from the sacraments, from community, from the hope of salvation. And so, the people adapted. They borrowed duller clothes for church. They dyed expensive garments to look faded. Some wore shawls over forbidden cloaks, or switched shoes outside the building. But even these acts carried risk. One slip, one moment of misjudgment, and the result? wasn't just embarrassment, it was shame, branded onto your reputation like a scar. Because in medieval society, to be publicly corrected was to be spiritually untrustworthy. And when judgment came, dressed in robes and silence, there was no appealing the verdict. In medieval society, the rules of dress were never neutral. They were deeply gendered, woven through with beliefs about morality, temptation, and one's role in the divine order. For men, clothing was expected to reflect humility and dignity. Their garments were functional, modest, and slightly loose-fitting, but noblemen could still wear rich fabrics, so long as they didn't display too much pride. A well-tailored tunic in dark wool? Acceptable. A long, jeweled belt or silk stockings? Questionable. Pointed shoes, curled at the tips like the horns of a devil? Dangerous, and often banned inside churches. But men, for the most part, were judged more gently. Women, however, were watched with far more scrutiny. To wear the wrong thing was not just a sign of arrogance, it was seen as inviting sin. A woman with uncovered hair might be accused of pride, or worse, seduction. A neckline too low, a sleeve too short, a flash of an ankle, all of it whispered danger in the minds of the clergy. Even a well-meaning woman who wore a brightly dyed scarf could face judgment if the color suggested joyfulness or festivity on a solemn religious day. Head coverings were perhaps the most strictly enforced. For married women especially, the veil or wimple wasn't just a cultural expectation. It was a moral obligation. To appear bareheaded in a chapel wasn't just scandalous. It was seen as a direct challenge to the biblical order, where a woman was to be modest, silent, and obedient. And yet, not all women had the luxury of choice. A widow might wear whatever she could find. A peasant girl might not own a proper cloak. A traveling stranger might wear clothing that, in her village, was perfectly normal, but here marked her as shameful. And so, women walked a narrow, invisible line. Too plain, and they were mocked for sloppiness. Too fine, and they were accused of seduction. Too somber, and they were whispered about as witches. Too joyful, and they were labeled as vain. Church, which should have been a place of peace, became for many women a place of quiet fear, where every thread could betray them, where faith was measured not just in prayer, but in how tightly a veil was tied. Because in the medieval mind, a woman's soul could be glimpsed through her sleeves, and her silence wasn't enough. Her dress had to speak for her. Not everyone followed the rules. Even in the most rigidly religious corners of medieval Europe, people found ways to bend, dodge, and quietly resist the strict codes of church attire. Some did it out of necessity. Others did it on purpose. Take, for example, a merchant's wife, newly wealthy, but still technically common in status. She might be barred from wearing fine velvet or imported blue dyes, but she finds a clever workaround. She commissions a local tailor to weave domestic wool to look like velvet. She dyes her fabrics with crushed berries, just enough to mimic the appearance of banned hues, without technically breaking the rule. Or consider a poor widow who owns a single, second-hand cloak, embroidered along the edge. She cannot afford another, so she wears it every Sunday. And though the embroidery is frowned upon, the priest, seeing her poverty, looks away. There were clergy, too, who understood the harshness of these rules. Some turned a blind eye. Others gently warned parishioners in private rather than shame them in public. But not all resistance was quiet. In some towns, women wore bold veils to protest the expectation of silence. In others, men wore slightly pointed shoes or extra buttons, not enough to be fined, but enough to test the boundary. These weren't rebellions in the modern sense. They were soft, slow acts of personal defiance, expressions of identity or dignity or quiet grief. There were loopholes, too. Sometimes the laws allowed noble servants to wear the clothes of their employers, while on duty. Some peasants clung to this technicality, wearing gifted hand-me-downs and claiming service or favor to avoid punishment. tailors became clever at disguising fine fabrics under layers of simpler cloth. Hems were let out or folded to hide forbidden trims during Mass. Even color was manipulated. A cloak could be dyed a darkened shade of red that no one could quite prove was illegal. Shoes might be painted dull brown, only to reveal their gloss again in the sunlight. And while the church may have tried to suppress pride, what these small acts of resistance showed was simple. People still cared about how they looked. They still longed to express themselves, to push, even gently, against the silence. Because even in a world ruled by fear, judgment, and the weight of sin, there was still creativity, still desire, still the quiet fire of rebellion, hidden in a fold of fabric. When we look back on these strange dress codes, it's tempting to laugh, to see them as absurd quirks of a long-lost world, as though the people of the Middle Ages were obsessed with sleeves and shoes while ignoring the bigger picture. But these laws, they weren't about fashion. They were about belief. To dress properly for church wasn't simply an act of obedience. It was a ritual, a physical expression of spiritual order. Just as prayers were spoken in certain ways and candles lit in specific numbers, clothing was part of the sacred script. Each thread had meaning. Each color had a place in the hierarchy. Each cut, stitch, and hem said something about who you were, and more importantly, who you were not. The rules reflected a deeply symbolic worldview, where the earthly mirrored the divine. If God created order in the heavens, then the world below must reflect that order, and that included the clothes people wore as they stood before him. Wearing garments above your station wasn't just inappropriate, it was seen as cosmic disorder. A tailor's apprentice in silk could be viewed as a soul stepping out of line. A milkmaid with a pearl comb might be feared as an omen of social collapse. And so, these rules weren't just enforced by priests and lords. They were believed by neighbors, by parents, by children who learned early which fabrics brought honor and which brought shame. Even those who resisted often still internalized the logic. They might skirt the edge of the rules, but they did so with care, aware of the spiritual weight behind each choice. Because clothing in the medieval mind wasn't just cloth. It was a statement of humility, of obedience, of faith. And to forget that, even for a moment, could mean being seen not only as vain, but as unworthy of God's grace. And so we return to that quiet, candlelit chapel, to the murmured prayers, the hush of stone walls, the flicker of flame against stained glass, and to the villagers, kneeling in rows, heads bowed, each one dressed not only for warmth or modesty, but for the divine. In today's world, it might seem strange to think that a piece of cloth, a splash of color, or the cut of a sleeve could carry such weight. But in the Middle Ages, those choices were everything. They were expressions of reverence, of discipline, of knowing one's place in the great, invisible structure of God's universe. It wasn't about personal style. It was about cosmic alignment. To wear the right thing to church was to step into harmony with creation, to show, not just with your heart or your voice, but with your body and garments, that you understood the gravity of faith. And while some of the rules may feel arbitrary, even harsh, they were rooted in something profoundly human, the desire to be seen as worthy, to be accepted, to belong to a world where everything, even clothing, had meaning. There's a strange beauty in that, a beauty in believing that what you wear before God matters. That humility can be stitched into cloth. That obedience can be worn like a second skin. Of course, it also left little room for freedom, for creativity, for comfort. It excluded those who couldn't afford the right look. It punished those who didn't conform, and it often placed unfair burdens, especially on women, the poor, and the young. But still, for all its oddities, the medieval church dress code was more than a list of rules. It was a mirror, reflecting how people saw themselves, how they saw others, and how they believed the divine order of heaven touched the earthly world below. So the next time you pull on a sweater or choose your Sunday best, remember this. Once upon a time, a cloak was never just a cloak. It was a confession. And in the sacred silence of a stone church, fashion didn't just speak, it prayed.